Welcome everyone to the PKU Mathematical Philosophy online event on the occasion of the centenary of Russell's visit to Peking University. Actually, almost exactly 100 years ago, on November the 7th, Russell gave his first lecture at the Peking University, translated by the famous linguist Zhao Yuanren, who also had a PhD in philosophy from Harvard. Since today we are so honored to have a special panel with the Russell professors to mark the Russell's visit, we think it's also probably nice to have a counterpart of Zhao Yuanren to host the event. Now let me introduce the host today, Professor Huw, a linguist and friend, colleague of ours at Peking University, who got his PhD also from Cambridge University, actually not that far from the philosophy department. So he's also a big fan of Russell. So Huw, the floor, or say the screen is yours, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Yanjing. And it is my honor to chair this very special panel for the centenary of Bertrand Russell's visit to Peking University. So 100 years ago, while staying in Peking University and in China, actually, Russell gave a series of talks that were widely reported and hugely influential. His talks covered issues on mathematical logic, analysis of mind, politics, and China's way out, among others. Today, China has changed, and the world has changed. But fortunately, our passion in philosophy hasn't. It remains. Although we cannot invite Bertrand Russell today again to give talks at Peking University, we can invite Bertrand Russell professor. And actually today we invited 3 Bertrand Russell professors, and we have a professional philosopher from Peking University, Professor Linhe Han, to give us talks. So let me firstly introduce our distinguished speakers. So firstly, we have Professor Simon Blackburn, who retired from the Bertrand Russell Chair of Bertrand Russell Chair of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge in 2011. He retains a fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge, and is also a fellow of British Academy. And then we have Professor Huw Price, who has recently retired after 9 years as Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy and a fellow of Trinity College at the University of Cambridge, and is also a fellow of British Academy. And now we have Professor Alexander Bert, who is now the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge. And finally, we have Professor Linhe Han from the Department of Philosophy at our university. Professor Han is a Changjiang Distinguished Professor, or in Chinese we say 长江特聘教授, 长江学者特聘教授, and he's also Director of Center of Analytical Philosophy at Peking University. So let me also say a bit more about the procedure of the special panel. So each speaker will give a 15-minute talk, and after these talks, we will have a general question to be addressed by our 4 speakers. And after the professors addressing of a general question, after their interaction, we will have the question and answer sessions. And in that session, you can raise your questions. So firstly, we'll have the first talk by Professor Simon Blackburn, and his title, as you can see here, is Russell and Structure. So now, Professor Simon Blackburn.
Thank you very much. Can you see me and hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. Yes, I'd like to start by saying thank you very much. It's a great honor to be part of this centenary conference. I had known, of course, that Russell visited China, and it was nice to have this opportunity to learn more about his visit. My own interest in Russell started when I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, of course. I remember in my first year reading the Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, and one of the first papers I ever published was on Russell's 1905 paper on denoting. On denoting contains a very mysterious couple of pages, at least they had proved mysterious, in which he seems to be attacking Frege's semantics and his distinction between sense and reference. in favor of substituting his own famous theory of definite descriptions. The attack on Frege had not been very influential. Frege was still regarded as a kind of god in analytical philosophy. But Alan Code of Berkeley and I, we met in the University of British Columbia, actually, in Vancouver, and we discovered a mutual interest in sorting out that passage, which eventually resulted in a paper we wrote in Analysis in 1976, defending Russell. We were attacked by Peter Geach, who's a great Frege disciple, but the controversy rumbled on, and I happen to think that we were right about it. So I've always been an enormous admirer of Russell. Recently, I had the motive to revisit one of his books, The Analysis of Matter, which he published shortly after he came back from China in 1927. And so it's probable that he was thinking about it. I do not know what the content of his lectures in China was when he lectured on logic, but it's very possible, metaphysics, it's very possible that he was thinking about this then, because it brought up a theme which is quite, it more or less lasts throughout Russell's life. I would argue from On Denoting in 1905, certainly until 1948, when one of his last books on human knowledge at scope and limits, was published. So I'll try and talk a little bit about that. Okay. So in 1927, Russell, in parallel with Carnap in the Aufbau, which was written in published in 1928, and a slightly earlier Schlick, Maurice Schlick, whose General Theory of Knowledge was published in 1925. And they were all hoping to use formal logic as a tool for understanding the epistemological problem of mind and world. Russell, in his earlier work in 1914, Our Knowledge of the External World, had, of course, advocated a sort of phenomenalism, which to many people seemed little better than Berkeleyan idealism. It basically confined us to a private world, each one of us, our own world, the contents of our own mind being available to us, and only so-called logical constructions out of those contents. And Russell became dissatisfied with that view by the 1920s. And he substituted a new view, which is now called structural realism. And this allowed two things. One, there's an external world, more robust sense than any that phenomenalism would give it. And secondly, however, all we can know about it is its structure. And it's that combination which still exists. It went down into the philosophy of science, especially in the decade of the 1950s, when people like Grover Maxwell took it up. And it's lingered on. Stathis Psillos has written about it, and other philosophers of science. So the philosophers of science aren't usually interested in Russell's project. They're not interested in philosophy of mind versus the external world, but they are interested in evidence versus theory. And it's the idea that scientific theories are built on evidence, and the theoretical entities then share these two properties with Russell. There is a theoretical world, but all we can know about theoretical entities are their structure, their structural properties. Why did Russell think this? Well, in one way, I think the program, and this is my theme of the unity of Russell's philosophy through time, I think it was a natural extension of Russell's distinction, which did occur in 1905, between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. The distinction, this is a quote from Russell, the distinction between acquaintance with things and knowledge about them is the distinction between the things we have presentations of and the things we only reach by means of denoting phrases. And Russell thought we didn't have acquaintance with items of the external world, but we knew about them by means of denoting phrases. By 1927, this had become the doctrine that the vocabulary of external things and functions of them, their relations, their properties, were all to be substituted by variables and existential quantifiers, giving what later became known as the Ramsey sentence of the theory, that there is a common sense physical world containing particular things with particular properties. So apart from logical vocabulary, the only denotations left referred to the items of immediate acquaintance, and those in Russell are sense data, the contents of your own mind. The device of substituting descriptions and quantificational descriptions and variables for theoretical terms, as they say, later became known as providing the Ramsey sentence. It was christened that by Hempel in sometime in the 1950s, I think 1955 perhaps. It's a little flattering to Ramsey and unfair to Russell, because I think the idea is certainly there in Russell. It recurs in Ramsey's very difficult paper, Theories, which was written in 1929. So I think that Russell should be seen as one of the founding fathers of structural realism. Okay, the trouble is that Russell's 1927 book met a rebuttal, a very neat little paper in Mind by another mathematician in Cambridge called Max Newman. Max Newman was by then a teacher in the mathematics faculty. He became a tutor of Alan Turing, and himself one of the great pioneers of computing in the years after the Second World War. Max Newman became one of the founding engineers and mathematicians in charge of the Manchester University computer, the Colossus, which was, some say, the first ever modern digital computer. So he's a very considerable mathematician, but he only ever wrote one philosophical paper, and that was this rebuttal of Russell. And the paper is a little gem. It's readily available on JSTOR from Mind 1928. He previously delivered it to the Moral Sciences Club in 1927, so it would have been well known around Cambridge. And what he pointed out is that any collection of things can be organized so as to have a structure, any structure you like, provided they're the right number of them. Hence, the doctrine that only structure is known involves the doctrine that nothing can be known that is not logically deducible from the mere fact of existence, except theoretically the number of constituting objects. In other words, if you've got a big enough set, any consistent theory can be modeled within that set. The Leeuwenheim and Skolem had been writing in the early 1920s, so this was a well-known result. The Leeuwenheim-Skolem theorem has become called upward and downward theorem. And Russell himself had said similar things in his Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy of 1919. So Newman's point was not original to Newman, but Russell had evidently overlooked it. And Russell replied to Newman. Newman sent Russell a copy of his paper, and Russell replied in a letter in the same year, 1928. And this letter is published in the second volume of Russell's autobiography, admitting to having read Newman's paper with some dismay. It is, of course, obvious, says Russell, as you point out, that the only effective assertion about the physical world involved in saying that it is susceptible to such and such a structure is an assertion about its cardinal number. So Russell immediately concedes to Newman. Newman is right about that. And the idea that we know some substantial things about the structure of the external world, when our only vocabulary, which is not a purely logical vocabulary, refers to the structure of our inner world, a different set of objects, that point seems absolutely certain. And he, in effect, pointed it out himself in 1919. Russell then suggested in his reply to Newman that he might consider adding to the pure observational basis, which refers only to this sort of kaleidoscope of internal impressions, some bridge notions, such as co-punctuality or spatiotemporal proximity. So he does by then realize that he needs what later became basically bridge laws, bridging the theoretical facts and the empirical facts as he sees them, the mental facts. He never gave up that idea, but he never, as far as I know, expanded it. He refers back to it, or he refers to a version of it in Human Knowledge at Scope and Limits, as I mentioned, in 1948. If physical events are to suffice as a basis for physics, and indeed if we are to have any reason for believing in them, they must not be totally unknown. Their space-time structure must be similar to the space-time structure of their effects on participants. And in 1948, he gives this example. From the fact that the sun is round in perceptual space, we have a right to infer that it is round in physical space. We cannot, however, infer that it is bright because brightness is not a structural property. Well, and that's the only example he gives. And then he darts off onto other issues in Human Knowledge at Scope and Limits. So he was obviously still wedded to this structuralism. But he obviously also knew that you need something more than he'd provided in his 1927 book. And I find it intriguing that he didn't investigate that further, that he left us with those hints. Other writers, this is the last thing I'll say, other writers who've taken up structural realism as the key to our understanding of science. These include Carnap. Carnap returned to the issue in the 1950s, Grover Maxwell, Hempel, and quite a lot of followers. And David Lewis, who wrote a number of papers about this issue, how to define theoretical terms, and new work for a theory of universals. They've often tried to define a privileged class of properties or relations, which somehow, as of right, get known to us. It's sometimes thought of as an elite class of predicates which refer to real relations, more than is given simply by the cardinality of the set of the domain of the relation. So there's a whole history following these remarks of Russell, which philosophers of science remain interested in. But I'd be very interested to hear if these ideas were in embryonic form, perhaps, in Russell when he lectured in China. They were certainly there by 1927. They were foreseen in 1919. I don't know what he was doing in the interval. So I hope to learn something about that from this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So as we said just now, if you have any question, you can just type in your questions and our speakers might select some relevant questions to answer later. So now we come to the second speaker, Professor Huw Price, and his talk title is Russell's Causal Irrealism. So Professor Huw Price.
Thank you. As you see, I've decided to use a slightly different title to relate what I want to say more closely to what I talked about last week. It's very nice to be here again and to have the pleasure of being here with Simon and Alexandra as well. In my lecture last week, I gave a rather Cambridge-centric survey of the fate of the issues discussed in Russell's celebrated paper on the notion of cause from 1912. And I argued that Ramsey's late piece from 1929, General Propositions and Causality, can be seen as vindicating some of Russell's claims, but with a less anti-realist conclusion. And I noted that although Ramsey's piece doesn't mention Russell's lecture, it's unlikely that Russell didn't know it. And at some points, it's easy to feel that Ramsey actually had it in mind in some of the passages in General Propositions and Causality. I mean, maybe this is a case of the kind of thing that Simon was suggesting just now. I mean, because we have in effect fragments and rough drafts from Ramsey, it's not surprising that they don't always refer to something, especially something that would have been as familiar to Ramsey as Russell's work. And since last week, I thought that I would go back to take a closer look at both of these pieces and to see if there was more that could be said about how they relate. And so that's what I want to do today, picking out one theme from Russell, which relates closely to the alternative that Ramsey provides. Now, as I said, Russell's piece is famously anti-realist about causation. Russell argues that a lot of what philosophers have traditionally thought about causation is, as he puts it, a relic of a bygone age. And this comes out clearly, among other places, at the end of his lecture, when he discusses the implications of his view about causation, his very dismissive view about causation, for issues of free will and determinism. He says, the subjective sense of freedom, sometimes alleged against determinism, has no bearing on the question of determinism and free will, whatever. The view that it has a bearing rests upon the belief that causes compel their effects, or that nature enforces obedience to its laws, as governments do. But these are mere anthropomorphic superstitions due to the assimilation of causes with volitions and of natural laws with human edicts. He goes on to say it's one of the demerits of the traditional theory of causality that it has created an artificial opposition between determinism and the freedom of which we're introspectively conscious. So this seems to be offered as good news for what we now call a compatibilist view of free will, and news that relies on deflating the opposition, as it were, on sort of deflating determinism, and arguing that the traditional determinist case against free will depends rather ironically on projecting our subjective sense of control into the physical world, where it has no place, according to Russell. So I want to take these references here of Russell's to the subjective sense of freedom and the freedom of which we're introspectively conscious, and now look to see what Ramsey does with those same materials. And it's from a passage in which Ramsey takes up some of the same questions that are discussed in Russell's paper. And these are the passages in particular which suggest to me that he must have had Russell's paper in mind. Ramsey says, it seems a fundamental fact that the future is due to the present, or more mildly is affected by the present, but the past is not. What does this mean? It's not clear, and if we try to make it clear, it turns into nonsense or a definition. Russell had said things very similar to that. We think there is some difference between before and after, says Ramsey, at which we're getting, but what can it be? So as I say on the slide there, it's very much in agreement with Russell, at least in asking the same questions. Ramsey goes on, what then do we believe about the future that we do not believe about the past? The past we think is settled. If this means more than that it's past, it might mean that it's settled for us, that nothing now could change our opinion of it. that any present event is irrelevant to the probability for us of any past event. But that's plainly untrue. And he gives an example. And again, this is very much in agreement with Russell, who points out that there are obviously correlations between the past and the present. Russell says, obviously our present wishes are conditioned by the past and therefore could not have been different unless the past were different. Therefore, if our present wishes were different, the past would be different. So there's certainly a correlation between the present, including our present wishes and volitions, and the past. But then Ramsey takes a different turn. He says, what is true is this, that any possible present volition of ours is, for us, irrelevant to any past event. To another, or to ourselves in the future, it can serve as a sign of the past. But to us now, what we do affects only the probability of the future. So Ramsey is pointing out or claiming that the first person present tense probabilities that we have as we make a decision are special. And they have this character that for those, within the scope of those probabilities, what we do, our present volitions are independent of anything in the past. Ramsey goes on to say, this seems to me to be the root of the matter, that I cannot affect the past is a way of saying something quite clearly true about my degrees of belief. Again, from the situation when we are deliberating, seems to me to arise the general difference of cause and effect. We are then engaged not in disinterested knowledge or classification, to which this difference is utterly foreign, as Russell in effect agrees, but on tracing the different consequences of our possible actions, which we do naturally in sequence forward in time, proceeding from cause to effect and not from effect to cause. And Ramsey says, other people we say, so he's given this very sort of first personal view of deliberation, and he's suggesting that it's the basis of our notion of causation. He says that he realizes that that's not all we need to, that this first personal view is not enough. So he says, other people, we say, can affect only the future and not the past for two reasons. First, by analogy with ourselves, we know that they can affect the future and not the past from their own point of view. So they have the same subjective point of view. And secondly, if we subsume their action under the general category of cause and effect, it can only be a cause of what is later than it. This means ultimately that by affecting it, we can only affect indirectly in our calculation events later than it. In a sense, Ramsey says, my present action is an ultimate and the only ultimate contingency. So what's happened here is that Ramsey has given us an account of what he elsewhere calls the psychology of causal thinking, grounded on that same subjective sense of freedom, in Russell's phrase, that Russell had invoked, but now neatly packaged in terms of subjective probabilities. So I want to leave you with a picture of where this leaves Ramsey in respect to two of his famous Cambridge contemporaries, one of them, of course, Russell. But before that, I want to point out that this move on Ramsey's part to talk about causation in terms of the subjective probabilities that we have in deliberation is, in one sense, exactly what we should expect from Ramsey, who's in effect just become the sort of grandfather of subjectivism about probability. I've already said that. In the case of probability, Ramsey was famously opposed to Keynes's theory of objective probability relations. And one of Ramsey's objections to these things is that the connection between these supposedly objective relations and our degrees of belief, the degrees of belief that we're supposed to have on the basis of them, is left entirely mysterious. And that's why he thinks that an account of probability has to begin with the psychology of decision making. So that's as it were the comparison in one direction. Comparison in the other direction is with Russell's eliminativism about causation. You see, going in one direction, he's opposed to somebody who's more of a realist than he is. Going in the other direction, he's opposed to somebody who's less of a realist. He sits in the middle, but what puts him in the middle is the same thing in both cases. It's the principle that in order to understand the problematic notion, probability in one case or causation in the other, we have to begin with the role that these notions, probabilistic notions and causal notions, play in our own thinking, and in particular in our thinking when we're betting and when we're deliberating. So once again, as with probability, causation is not mysterious as long as we start our account of it with the psychology of decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have a third speaker, Professor Alexander Bert, and the title of his talk is Russell's Place in the Birth of Modern Logic. So Professor Bert.
Okay, that's better. I'm unmuted now. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to do this and to interact with colleagues at Peking University on this interesting centenary of Russell's visit. This invitation calls me to go back to some very early work I did. Indeed, when I was a student at Cambridge on Russell, when I was particularly interested in Russell's logic and then his reductionism. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm just about to share my screen and talk about Russell and the birth of modern logic. Okay, let's. Okay, I'm going to talk about the four principal characters who played a role around the year 1900 in the origins of modern logic. I could add David Hilbert, but he doesn't play a particular role in this story, and his influence was largely later. Of these, philosophers particularly concentrate on Frege and Russell, but it should be remembered that around this time, Frege was almost entirely unknown. And indeed, his influence on logic and on the history of philosophy really comes only through Bertrand Russell, whereas Georg Cantor and Giuseppe Peano were much better known at the time, especially Cantor, whose work on the infinite was particularly controversial, with people who were pro-Cantor and those who were against him. And indeed, for a while, Russell was against him as well. Peano, I think, is underrated in the history of logic, and he had a profound influence on Russell, as we shall see. We need to have a clear idea, I think, of what was going on in Cantor's famous proof that the power set of a set is always larger than the set itself. So let's have a look at that proof. So what we do is we consider a set S and its power set, the set of all its subsets. What Cantor does is, in order to show that the power set is strictly larger than the set itself, is that he assumes that it isn't, that there is a one-to-one correlation, in this case provided by the function f, between these two sets, and he shows that that leads to a contradiction. Okay, so now what we do is we construct these two complementary subsets of S. So those members of S, X, where X is an element of its own image under F, and we call these sets members of sigma, and we can construct the complement of sigma for those sets Z such that they are not elements of their image under F of Z. Both sigma and sigma star are sets made up of members of S, so they're subsets of S, and therefore they are members of the power set of S itself. So let's look at sigma star. Since this is an element of the power set of S, there has to be a member of S with which it one-to-one correlates. We call this X star. So what we do then is ask whether X star is a member of sigma or of sigma star. The definition means that every member of S is going to be a member of one or other of sigma or sigma star. And what we can quite easily see is that a contradiction will arise out of either of those cases. So we get a contradiction from the assumption that there's a one-to-one correlation between the members of S and its power set. So the power set has to be strictly larger. Now, Russell in the 1890s was making a study of Cantor, partly because he was interested in the foundations of geometry at the time, and was interested in the study of continuity, and that led to an interest in the infinite and so forth. Now, as a student at Cambridge, he had studied both mathematics and philosophy, and his philosophy was strongly influenced by Hegel and the British Hegelians, such as MacTaggart. But he slowly came round to a pro-Cantor view by the late 1890s, having tried to reject Cantor's views of the infinite. And regarding the proof that we've just looked at, Russell says, in this one point, the master has been guilty of a very subtle fallacy, which I hope to explain in some future work. Now, a seminal year for Russell was the year 1900, in which he went to Paris in the middle of the year, in summer, to attend two congresses, one a congress of philosophers and the other congress of mathematicians. And he says that this was the occasion of a turning point, or the turning point, in his intellectual life. Because he says, there I met Peano. I already knew him by name and had seen some of his work, but hadn't taken the trouble to master his notation. In discussions at the Congress, I observed that he was always more precise than anyone else, and that he invariably got the better of any argument on which he embarked. As the days went by, I decided that this must be owing to his mathematical logic. It became clear to me that his notation afforded an instrument of logical analysis such as I had been seeking for years. And he went on to say, I went up to Peano and said, I wish to read all your works. Have you got copies with you? He had, and I immediately read them all. It was they that gave the impetus to my own views on the principles of mathematics. So no stronger endorsement of the significance of Peano could be needed than that. So what did Russell do in the subsequent years? Well, at the time he was working on his book, The Principles of Mathematics, which he finished, or at least he thought he finished, on the very last day of 1900, which, as he correctly, although perhaps slightly pedantically, pointed out, was the very last year of the 19th century. As a result of reading Peano, Russell came across Burali-Forty's paradox. Burali-Forty was a member of Peano's school and published this paradox in 1897. It hadn't perhaps received that much attention for various reasons, one of which was that it was written in Peano's notation, which Russell now understood. What Burali-Forty's paradox pointed out, in an attempt to prove a particular error in Cantor, was that we consider the set of all ordinals, that itself should be well ordered and therefore defines, or is, depending on how you define the ordinals, itself an ordinal. And that will allow us to construct a greater ordinal. And then we have a contradiction. This larger ordinal is both a member of the set of all ordinals, because it's an ordinal, but isn't a member of it because it's greater than the set of all ordinals. Raleigh-Fortey's paradox gave Russell an insight into the nature of Cantor's proof. As we said, he was looking to find a flaw in Cantor's proof. But as Russell himself said, he tried to apply this proof to the new supposed class of all imaginable objects, and he was led to a new and simpler contradiction. So let's see how that new and simpler contradiction arises. So this here is the structure of Cantor's proof. But now consider that S is the set of everything that there is, or possibly more precisely, the set of all sets. And now we consider the power set of everything. In Cantor's proof, we just consider a one-to-one correlation provided by the function, some function, f. But when we're considering S being the set of everything, or at least the set of all sets without all elements, then the relation that we're looking for, the one-to-one correlation function f, is going to be simple. It can just be the identity function. If we allow f to be the identity function, which takes any object to itself, then Cantor's proof transforms itself into this. So look at the second part of the proof. What we are doing here is defining these two subsets of S. And the second of these is the set of all things that are not members of themselves. And we call this sigma star. And then we can ask of sigma star, is sigma star a member of itself or of sigma, its complement? And that is, in essence, Russell's paradox, which he discovered in 1901, having, as it were, combined his reading of Cantor with his reading of Peano and Peano's school, including Raleigh-Fortey. In the following year, in 1902, Russell read the works of Frege. As I mentioned, he had just finished work on the principles of mathematics, although he was at this point still making some changes. Nonetheless, he wasn't able to incorporate the insights of Frege wholesale. And so he included an appendix in which he made some comments on Frege, including this one. So I think what we get from this is that Russell realized the importance of Frege, but on the other hand, Frege tended to correspond to Russell's own views. However, despite these very positive words, Russell was aware of a fatal flaw in Frege's work, the basic laws of arithmetic. So Frege had sought to show how arithmetic can be deduced from his axiomatization of logic. And a key axiom in that axiomatization is his basic law 5, which in effect says every predicate determines an extension. Russell wrote to Frege straight away, telling him that this law leads to a contradiction, the very same contradiction that he had discovered the previous year, as I just discussed. He said, look, let W be the predicate, to be a predicate that cannot be predicated of itself. Can W be predicated of itself? Well, from each answer, the opposite follows. Therefore, we must conclude that W is not a predicate. And so, therefore, likewise, there is no class as a totality of those classes which, each taken as a totality, don't belong to themselves. From this, I conclude that under certain circumstances, a definable collection does not form a totality. What we see here is that Russell not only exposes the problems of Frege's logic, but is also coming round to the very Cantorian idea of the unboundedness of the transfinite. A few years later, Russell came across the Paradox of Richarl, published in 1905. Richarl pointed out that we can, using ordinary language, define certain numbers. But because sentences of a natural language can be well ordered by some numbering system, we can therefore order the numbers that they determine. And so, for example, as we have here, we have 3 natural language ways of determining numbers and the decimals that they thereby determine. What Richarl pointed out was that we can define a new number, n, using Cantor's diagonal method, that is not on this list. And we do this as follows. We define n as the decimal that takes each of these and differs from it in 1 digit. So we take the first on our list and we take the first digit in that first number and we increase it by 1. And then we take the second digit of the second number and increase that by 1. And then the third digit of the third number and then increase that by 1. And if it's a 9, then we put it to 0. And clearly this number n differs from all the numerals already on our list in at least 1 place. So it's not on the list, and therefore it needs to be added to this list. But we said that this list contains all the numerals definable in natural language. And so we have a contradiction because I've just used a finite definition in order to define n. Richarl's paradox led Russell to formulate, along with Poincaré, the vicious circle principle. He said things like this: what involves all of a collection must not be one of the collection, and so on. Although Russell at first had difficulties in being precise about what the vicious circle principle maintains, we can see that in essence it's negative, pointing to one source of contradiction which must be excluded. So it's intended as a criterion of meaningfulness. We must construct our mathematical logic and its language in such a way that expressions that violate the principle are meaningless. On which positive principles the logic should be constructed, the vicious circle principle doesn't directly suggest. But Russell did have a positive view arising out of the vicious circle principle and his thinking about it, different response from that of Poincaré. It led to his theory of types, which he first published in 1908, and that became the foundations of his and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, the first volume of which appeared in 1910. There he says that in matters of notation, they have, as far as possible, followed Peano, whereas in the questions of logical analysis, their chief debt is to Frege. It is, I think, fair to say that Principia Mathematica is the foundational text of modern logic. It combines the insights of Peano and of Frege, and indeed of Cantor as well. And this seems a suitable point at which to finish my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So now we have our final speaker, this time from Peking University, Professor Linhe Han. And Professor Han's title is Some Remarks on Wittgenstein's Critical View of Russell's Conception of Language in Analysis of Mind. So Professor Han.
Okay, I cannot find my PowerPoint. Okay, just read the PowerPoint. Just now, Professor Blackburn talked about Russell's lectures on the matter, on the analysis of matter in Peking University in 1920s. The other topics Russell talked about in his visit to China at that time is an analysis of mind. In one of these lectures, Russell understands the use of language as a mere causal process. So the meaning of a word is defined by its causal efficacy. If a word has the same causal efficacy as an object, then it means the object, and the object is meaning. Russell writes in the analysis of mind, the essence of language lies not in the use of this or that special means of communication, but in the employment of fixed associations, in order that something now sensible, a spoken word, a picture, a gesture, or whatnot, may call up the idea of something else. Whenever this is done, what is now sensible may be called a sign or symbol, in that of which it is intended to call up the idea may be called its meaning. This is a rough line of what constitutes meaning. The other passage, the relation of a word to its meaning is of the nature of a causal law, governing our use of the word and our actions. When we hear it used, there is no more reason why a person who uses a word correctly should be able to tell what it means than there is why a planet which is moving correctly should know Kepler's laws. Russell, in these passages, claims that the causal laws involved in the use and understanding of language are very different from those in the physical field. They are unique causal laws in the psychological field. He writes, whenever the effect resulting from a stimulus to an organism differs according to the past history of the organism, without our being able actually to detect any relevant difference in its present structure, we will speak of mimic causation, provided we can discover laws embodying the influence of the past. Ogden and Richards, in their book, The Meaning of Meaning, hold a very similar view of language. In the following passages, Wittgenstein calls this conception of language the magical understanding or conception of science, and his own conception, the logical understanding or conception of science. Wittgenstein wrote in his typescript 213, I can imagine that a philosopher might believe he had to have a sentence printed in red, since only in this way would it express completely what the author wanted to say. Here, we would have a magical rather than logical understanding of science. The magical sign would have the effect of a drug, and for it, the causal theory would be correct. After all, the signs in a sentence aren't talismans or magical symbols, which are supposed to cast a certain spell on the beholder. There are other passages in the biggest script in which Wittgenstein criticizes the causal conception or meaning of language. He's right, but would that really be so nonsensical? Don't we in fact use space tag? I want to say the effect of a sentence on one's feeling is not its sense. Investigating the meaning, whether the meaning of a sign is effect, is a grammatical investigation. The sense of language is not determined by its effect, or what one calls sense, meaning in language is not its effect. With regard to the above passages in the following points should be noted. First, in criticizing the causal conception of language, Wittgenstein does not want to deny the fact that the learning and the use of language involve lots of causal processes. Then he points out that these causal processes are very important and interesting and should be investigated. Here, he only wants to remind us the fact that they do not constitute the essential aspect of language. Second, it is absurd to identify meaning relation with causal relation, like Russell and Richard, etc. did. According to this conception of meaning, we seem to be able to regard somebody falling down as the meaning of the event of his being pushed by someone. Third, Wittgenstein tries to defeat the causal conception of language with the help of his distinction of motive and cause. The relation between one motive and the action which it leads to, according to Wittgenstein, is internal, whereas the relation between cause and the action which it brings out is external. Correspondingly, the relation between linguistic expression and the effect which is used brings out is external, whereas the relation between a linguistic expression and meaning and that of it and its understanding is internal. Namely, it is defined by the grammatical rules that govern it. Finally, Wittgenstein calls the attempt of Russell and Ogden and Richards to understand the meaning relation by means of unique causal laws, psychologistic philosophy, holding that they are walking into a typical philosophical dead end. In his notebook, manuscript 109 and 7, Wittgenstein wrote, "There is a kind of philosophy, one might call it a psychologistic philosophy, but I have not yet found a good name for it, which always speaks of associations and the simultaneous or vaguely simultaneous occurrence of events A, B, and C of similar constituents of two events having the consequence that the whole crosses one's mind when a part comes before our eyes. A typical philosophical dead end, the combination of attempted exactness and actual irrelevance." So in his early 1930s manuscripts and text scripts, Wittgenstein wrote lots of passages, remarks with a view to criticize Russell's conception of causal conception of meaning and the language by means of his distinction between reason and cause. According to Wittgenstein, motive of our actions is a kind of reason, but not cause. So that's what I want to talk in this short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Han. So now we will come to the interaction session. And as I said at the very beginning, we will firstly raise a general question for you to address. So we designed the question together. It's like this. So Bertrand Russell was initially invited to give lectures at Peking University on mathematical philosophy, but he actually did not finish all his lectures due to his pneumonia. And also he mentioned in a letter to Wittgenstein that at that time, Chinese students were not very much familiar with formal tools such as mathematical logic to understand his talks on mathematical philosophy. Now, because now we have the talks all on mostly on philosophy of language, I mean analytical philosophy, etc. So our question is today now if we were talking to young scholars and students of philosophy, to what extent the tools of mathematics or the tools of scientific, or I mean the tools in scientific inquiry are still very much important in the current frontier research of analytical philosophy or even philosophy in general. And also, as a personal addition, do you think that the knowledge or some training or skills from theoretical linguistics might also contribute to the research in philosophy? Because in linguistics, actually, we have gained a lot from analytical philosophy, especially in the study of formal semantics. Thank you very much. So, please. Yes, Professor Price.
Could I have a go at that? I mean, I think what I want to say is that philosophy has many frontiers. It's probably true that philosophy has become more specialized over the last 100 years. But some of my own philosophy and philosophy of science connects with philosophy of physics. So that's an area in which I can talk about the usefulness of a knowledge of technicality. And there, I think it's undoubtedly true that in the period in which I've been in the field, there's been remarkable progress, and a lot of it has come from people who, unlike me, have a really deep knowledge of physics. And so that's a case in which it's certainly true that philosophy requires specialist knowledge of, in this case, a rather formal science. And I'm sure that's true in philosophy of language too, picking up on your question about linguistics, and in many other areas. I mean, I think, although not all philosophy requires formal techniques, many areas of it do. And I suspect that there's always going to be a place in philosophy for people who come to it, as I did, from other subjects, from mathematics and physics and so on.
Any addition from other professors?
Yes. I think I'd like to endorse what Hugh said. I think one can say a few additional things. So in general, I think that the fact that you teach all our students basic propositional and predicate calculus is a good idea. I'm not sure everything that we teach them in that area is necessary, but basic acquaintance with those, I think, is important, not least just for the simple thing of it gives one tools with which to be, in certain circumstances, more precise than one can easily be with natural language. But beyond that, I think that what we should give our students and each have is awareness of an array of formal methods that we might be able to make use of, or at least exemplars, paradigms of how we do so, whether that's a knowledge of Bayesianism, which can be useful in a whole raft of areas of philosophy, to use the formalizations of modal logic, which I think gives us new tools for more subtle understanding of issues of modality and how those have parallels, for example, in epistemology. So again, there are areas where at least being able to, that there's a toolkit of a variety of different tools that one can make use of in is a good idea. There's lots of different areas of philosophy, and there won't be, with possible exception of the basic logic, any tools that will be useful in all areas, but there are going to be lots of different tools that formal tools that might be useful in different areas, and being confident and competent at using some of them, and thinking that developing new formal techniques is a possible way of tackling at least some philosophical problems, or at least making them a little bit more tractable than they currently are.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So it seems that Professor Simon Blackburn.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, I wasn't being allowed to unmute until this moment. Thank you. Yes, I agree entirely with what both Hugh and Alexander have said. I think that there are areas of philosophy of physics, philosophy of mathematics, where you simply can't move without a considerable knowledge of formal techniques. In philosophy of physics, the formal techniques of mathematical physics. In the philosophy of mathematics, of course, you would need a considerable awareness of set theory, its foundations, as well as recursive function theory. Perhaps formal logic isn't heavily involved in all of that. I think in other philosophical inquiries, it's less prominent. And sometimes I think it can do more harm than good. That is, if we think about economics, there's a huge issue about whether the mathematization of economics has actually enabled economists to think better about economies, or whether they thought as well as they need to or can do without a great deal of the mathematics. So that's I think an ongoing debate in economics. And I think something similar is true in, for example, the philosophy of value. You get people who, in a dismissive phrase, try to do ethics by numbers, and that's not necessarily a very good idea. So I think you've got to be sure that if you're going to use formal tools, the formal tools are well adapted to whatever it is you're trying to solve. One of my jobs was once to be the editor of the British Journal of Philosophy Mind, and one of my predecessors was a man called Gilbert Ryle, who looked after Mind in the 1950s and 60s, and he was famous for not allowing any formal symbols in any of the papers that got published in Mind. That was a sort of almost conscious slap in the face to some of the formal, formal work. I did not hold that policy, and my successors as editors of Mind have, I think, lent the other way and published some very formal papers whose point it's quite hard to discern. So I think you just got to be careful. You've got to be sure that if you have formal techniques at your disposal, you're applying them accurately to whichever problems you're tackling, not just using them for the sake of filling a page with symbols. And that is, I think, an exercise of judgment, which we all have to make.
Thanks.
Yes, I agree with all of the three professors with regard to this question. I think that the formal tools are not absolutely necessary for us to do philosophy. Even with regard to the philosophy of language, you could do good philosophy of language without using any formal tools.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the way of the late Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And J.L. Austin wrote, How to Do Things with Words, and other works in the philosophy of language without ever mentioning or using a quantifier or a truth function.
That's right, yeah.
You also asked about formal linguistics.
Yeah.
I'm not in a very good position to answer that because I don't know very much formal linguistics. I think I was put off by the prominence of Chomsky in formal linguistics. And whenever I tried to understand what Chomsky was saying, it seemed to go in one ear and out the other, as we say. So I think I have a slight allergy to formal linguistics. On the other hand, I'm aware that some of the examples they give and some of the things they say are very useful. So it's a literature I quite like to dabble in, but not to really master.
Thanks. Thank you very much for sharing these great ideas. And we have a bit more time for you professors to like raise your own questions to your, to each other that you have interest in, or whatever, general questions in philosophy of, in philosophy of language or in analytical philosophy or whatever. Yeah.
Actually, can I also ask or say some remark? Yeah. So the host, may I?
Yeah, of course. You
Yeah,
are the
okay. Yeah. I actually also saw in the chat someone, I think one of the participants also asked a question, which I also want to raise similar points. So I think there is a bigger and bigger gap between the so-called more technical philosophy involving a lot of, say, formal tools or mathematical methods, and also the philosophy doing without so-called symbols. But indeed, as a philosophical logician myself, I sometimes got this feeling that, okay, so for example, in my field, I do epistemic logic. Sometimes I do feel, okay, so the motivation for our work in philosophical logic in many cases are philosophical, to understand certain concept and the connection between concepts. But soon after the early days, then the technical philosophers and the logicians quickly move into building more and more complicated tools. So in many cases, we sort of lose the initial motivation, or say the original, the goal of the formal tools. And in this way, indeed, I see wider and wider gaps between the formal work and the relatively informal work. But as this participant also asked, and we actually hope there can be more sort of middlemen who really understand, say, both philosophy and really necessary formal tools to really do good work. I think there are some, like our heroes like Kit Fine or say Stalnaker, such people, but it's indeed very hard to find the balance and try to use the necessary, really helping tools to do the core philosophical questions. Yeah, I think that's really so. I'm wondering. Okay, so now the question: do you have? So if I ask you to say what would be the best example you think that formal tools or techniques can really help? I mean, after Russell, of course, Russell did great work. But if I want to ask you, what about your best example in contemporary philosophy nowadays? What would you say? So maybe many people would learn from this. I mean, that they would like to see examples of formal tools really play an essential role, not just to fill in the pages of good journals with symbols. Yes, so that's my question. Yeah, thanks.
I think Bayes was mentioned, and I think one thing which all epistemologists need some acquaintance with is the logic of Bayes' theorem and the way that it could be used to adjust subjective probabilities, or personal probabilities, as I prefer to call them. I don't think you could be a well-trained epistemologist without having some knowledge of that. In fact, I don't think you can even read Hume's essay on miracles without profiting from giving or understanding a Bayesian analysis of it. So I would certainly mention that as a prime candidate. But of course, also you can't understand an awful lot of what people say about reference, say descriptions versus proper names, without at least understanding the basics of the predicate calculus. I do think that for a general philosophy education, your first year in formal logic, or first couple of terms, taking you up perhaps to the possibility of defining cardinal number in terms of quantification, but not necessarily going as far as something like Gödel's theorems. I think that's the essence. After that, things like Gödel's theorem, Peano's proof, as you say, or Cantor's proof, those are relatively specialist. And I think students should only go into those in their second year if they're pointed that way. They don't have to go there for quite a lot of philosophy.
Hello, hi. Yanjing, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yeah.
Okay, I would just want to make a remark. I want to speak from my personal experience. I think because the audience is in China and I was trained in China, so I guess I might have some similar background with a lot of the students here. That is, so as a Chinese students, a lot of us, we have a very technical background. And usually, and I can see, and this is the entry point for a lot of the students to philosophy. And and as the professors mentioned, that this, of course, the technicality you want to master depends on the subject you want to specialize in. For instance, if you study set theory, of course, you need to spend years and years of training in set theory per se in order to ask even natural philosophical question about the subject. So, but also I want to recommend that don't get lost in all the technical training. So, because if you get into the philosophical world, this will open your mind. You will see a lot of very interesting subject. So I know it's very difficult to balance the two, but I just want to remind everybody that be open-minded and on the selection of your specialized field. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So Professor Liu, you might want to introduce yourself, or Yanjing, you want to give introduction to Professor Liu?
Okay, I'm not professor, and so I was trained. I studied back in China, and I went to Columbia to get my PhD. I'm currently a researcher at the University of Cambridge. Yeah, and my subject, I was trained as a logician, and my dissertation is on philosophy of probability. Yeah, I now work also at the Liverhume Center for the Future of Intelligence, and interesting on philosophy of AI and stuff. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we actually, because this is an event in a sense to memorize Russell's visit to Peking University. So I'm wondering whether Professor Han is happy to give us a bit more introduction about Russell's visiting Peking or in China in general, like you know, the things he did there here and the talks and the influence he exerted on Chinese society.
Yes, I read some reports in the paper, in the newspapers at that time, several days ago. Yeah, it is a huge event at that time. I think with regard to my writing and work, the most important thing related to his visit might be that he suggested to Professor to Zhang Shenfu translate Tractatus Logical Philosophy Quiz. Yeah, so as early as 1927 to 1928, the Tractatus is already translated into Chinese by Zhang Shenfu. Zhang Shenfu is one of professor to invite Russell to China to give us a series of lectures. In the morning, I talked to my student and I got a recite passage from Yanjing, in which Yanjing mentioned that Zhang Shenfu invited Professor Russell. So I think that it might be that Professor Russell gave Zhang Shenfu a suggestion to translate the Tractatus. Yeah, that's a very important event in China, in early China, 20th centuries. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think I can also add something. First of all, this guy Zhang Shenfu is probably the biggest Russell fan at that moment, because he was the single one person who sort of introduced Russell's work to the Chinese academia. And of course, he has a lot of, he has a very high hope on Russell's visit to China, not only in terms of theoretical philosophy, but also in terms of finding future for Chinese people. Yeah, but I also want to say something about, say, Russell's lectures in Peking University about mathematical logic, because I'm a logician. Yeah, so I think it's very interesting that Russell selected some, at least to my view, some sort of marginal topic as the starting point in his lecture on mathematical logic, which is about this Scheffer's chalk. But maybe I sort of think maybe there is a link to this translator I mentioned, the famous linguist Zhao Yuanren, because I think Zhao Yuanren did a PhD in Harvard with Scheffer. And in Russell's first lecture, he just introduced this Scheffer's chalk and present a axiomatization of the propositional logic using this single connective. But to some extent, I can imagine that to the Chinese student at that time, they didn't get so much about logic. And suddenly you see this Scheffer's chalk, which doesn't have really much intuition behind it. So I can imagine how hard it would be for them to swallow this. And the second lecture was about, say, the algebra of classes. It's more like, well, algebra of sets or something. So it sounds a little bit strange to me, because it's not exactly like what he present things like in this Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy book he published just 1 year before. So he just chose some topic which can be hard for Chinese students to follow. But in any case, I think at least one thing left after his lectures is how he started his first lecture on mathematical logic. So he mentioned mathematical logic compared to mathematics is the way to look backward, and the mathematics is going forward. And going backward doesn't mean you're say doing unnecessary things, but you're trying to track the foundations and to understand what is the assumptions and the basic axioms. And I think that kind of passage is quite popular in China, at least in the circle of philosophical and mathematical logicians, I think. But unfortunately, after the second lecture, he got ill, so he didn't go on to do other lectures. So, but if you are interested, I actually can send you the English translation of his first lectures, because I think he didn't have a note for his lectures in China. So we only got, say, some people written down some notes for his lectures. And now some people have translated those Chinese notes published in some newspapers into English. Maybe that's also interesting for you. Yeah.
Could I say something? I think the library at Trinity College would be absolutely delighted to have an English translation of Russell's.
Okay, great.
China. So if you'd be kind enough to send them to me, I could make sure.
I will send them to you. Yes.
And possibly the faculty library. I don't know what Alexander thinks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I know Trinity would love to have it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah.
Yeah, everyone would.
Yeah.
Okay. Seems that we don't have other questions. Let me see. Okay. So I'm taking advantage of being the chair of this panel. So if there is no other question, I want to ask a question that has been interesting me for years. So I'm a linguist, and I know that the goals of linguistics and the goals of philosophy are very much different, although we both do research in language. So as far as I know, I'm not an expert, so if it's my misunderstanding, please forgive me. So as far as I know, one of the motivations for the application of mathematical logic in study of language in philosophy is to clear away the so-called confusions in philosophy, because according to Russell and many other people, many confusions actually are from language. So if we can have the application of mathematics in the study of language, then we can clear away all these confusions and we can solve many philosophical problems. So my question is now, about 100 years later, more than 100 years later, after the foundation of, let's say, analytical philosophy, to what extent can we see that this field of philosophy has really contributed to the clearing away of the confusion in philosophy? So that's kind of a question from a layman, not from a professional philosopher. Thanks.
Shall I have a go at that?
Yeah, please.
I'm inclined to answer very pessimistically, and think that philosophy tends to go in circles. I mean, for example, when I started in philosophy as a student in the 1960s, there was a lot of optimism in the air that some version of ordinary language philosophy, or perhaps something from the work of Wittgenstein, would, for once and all, lay the mind-body issue to rest, the hard problem of consciousness. There's considerable thought that it was a tissue of linguistic confusions. And I think that, you know, possibly, whether or not he actually thought this, but followers of Wittgenstein certainly thought that he'd shown the way to clear away the confusions that gave rise to the philosophy of mind, the difficulties in the philosophy of mind. And I think that optimism lasted for, perhaps until the 1990s or so. There were still people thinking that. But then in the 1990s, people started talking about the hard problem of consciousness. And it's now as if Wittgenstein and Austin and Ryle had never written. They just nobody's talking about them, nobody's reminded of them. And so the philosophy of mind, in my view, has gone back to, not necessarily the philosophy of language, the understanding of meaning. I think that has advanced. But I think the idea that there's a neat solution to be had from language study, or from the study of the philosophy of language, to remove the philosophy of mind, I think that is now a very minority view. I think I'm one of the few people in the world who still clings on to it because I was taught it. So I think that one has to beware thinking of philosophical progress as somehow cleared away by the philosophy of language or by study of linguistic philosophy. I mean, I'm certainly not denying that logic and formal methods, I already mentioned Bayes' theorem, and we've mentioned logic quite a lot, that they have a very important role to play. But whether they give you the big metaphysical results that people promised, that I'm not so sure about.
Thanks. Thank you.
Could I just offer a kind of footnote to Simon's remarks there, which I agree with, especially the remark about how philosophy tends to go in circles. But since Simon had mentioned the idea how, at least when he came into the subject, the view that a kind of Wittgensteinian approach to language could help to sort of get rid of confused projects in philosophy. That's a therapeutic view. I think for the sake of this discussion, it's important to make the point that not all of that by any means rests on the idea that it's formal approaches to language that we need to do that. Quite the contrary for a lot of it. I mean, as Simon said earlier, Austin didn't approach language by formal techniques. And so we need to separate two questions, whether thinking about language and what we do with language can be useful in solving philosophical problems, or perhaps in showing us that we don't need to show some of them. And then it's a separate question whether there are cases in which applying formal techniques to language can throw light on philosophical problems. But for the first of those things, I think, since I mentioned Ramsey in my talk, I think it's worth mentioning that you could see the kind of approach that Ramsey is taking, both to probability and to causation, as being very closely related to that approach, which, as it were, deals with philosophical problems by treating them as issues about language rather than as issues about the world. And I mean, it's kind of not surprising that Ramsey should be doing that, given that we've already mentioned Wittgenstein doing that, because as now seems clear, especially in the work of Sharon Missack, Ramsey was a huge influence on the change in Wittgenstein's thought that's led Wittgenstein to think that way. In the paper I mentioned, Ramsey puts it in terms of psychology, not in terms of language. But it's a very similar view.